Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
America has led the world in protecting liberty, but in recent years that reputation has been torn to shreds. The list of the U.S.'s own human rights abuses goes on and on. The result has been disastrous. Even America's longtime friends have become disillusioned with us, from 62% to 39% in France, 78% to 37% in Germany, 75% to 30% in our traditional Muslim ally, Indonesia, and 52% to a miserable 12% in Turkey. And when our own human rights record is tainted, it makes it harder than ever to criticize the practices of other countries that abuse human rights. Human rights are important to Americans. They reflect who we are as a people. They're in our national interests. Showing the world that we respect the rule of law makes it harder for extremists to rally people against us. And supporting human rights is one of the best things America can do for the rest of the world.
America did not invent human rights. Human rights invented America.
Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope.
After a pre-identified first questioner does so, and we will provide an opportunity as long as possible for all of us to talk together about these important issues. Today also marks the launch of a new book from the University of Pennsylvania Press in association with the Center for American Progress, The Future of Human Rights, U.S. Policy for a New Era, in which 13 experts in human rights outline prospective policy for a new president. You may have noticed that the cover of the book is the same as the logo of the conference. It's called Subliminal Advertising. It's available to you all day today in the foyer, and if you'd like me to autograph a copy for you in order to increase its value when you sell it on eBay, I'd be happy to do that. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh in the 1950s, I was certain of three things. I was certain, because my parents had told me it was so, that when nuclear war came, Pittsburgh's steel mills would be the very first target that the Russians bombed. I was certain, however, that if I would only duck and cover under my wooden desk, I would be safe from radiation. And I was certain that the American flag stood for what was best in the world, brave and virtuous. Well, the first of those certainties, thank God, was never tested. The second would have failed if it had been. And the third has been banged up and tarnished. It's true. But I still believe it, still believe in the best of the American tradition. That part of our tradition is manifest in a Roger Williams, who thought the early colonists ought to pay the Indians for the land that they had appropriated. In a Samuel Sewall, one of the judges at the Salem witchcraft trials, offering public apology for the sentences that he had been responsible for imposing only 5 years after the trials. It's manifest in the Bill of Rights. It's manifest in a Lydia Maria Child demanding an end to slavery, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton expressing outrage at the oppression of women, a Sojourner Truth leading slaves to freedom, and Abraham Lincoln 1 month before Appomattox, 1 month calling for malice toward none and charity for all. It's manifest in the defeat of fascism, in Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, in Eleanor Roosevelt's vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in Truman's support for the United Nations, in Eisenhower's stirring conviction in his 1958 State of the Union address that the only answer to a regime that wages total Cold War is to wage total peace. It's manifest in Gerald Ford's support of the Helsinki Accords, in Reagan's meeting with Soviet dissidents in Moscow, in the war in Kosovo. It's manifest in the civil rights movement, in the courage of those military lawyers who have defended prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, often at the expense of their careers. It's manifest in all those who know that they would not be where they are today if their immigrant ancestors had been treated the way some propose to treat the latest generation of Americans. All these manifestations of the best of the American tradition involve human rights. For Jimmy Carter was absolutely right. America did not invent human rights. Human rights invented America. And the message of this conference is that human rights will reinvent America once again. And now, to extend greetings from the co-sponsoring institutions of this conference, are first the director of Georgetown Law's superb Human Rights Institute, Professor of Law Jane Stromseth, who will be followed by the genius behind the Center for American Progress, former Chief of Staff to President Clinton and President and CEO of the Center for American Progress, John Podesta, who will in turn introduce Secretary Albright. Jane Stromseth.
Thank you, Bill, for those inspiring words of introduction. It's been a great pleasure working with you and with the Center for American Progress in making this conference possible. I am delighted to welcome you here this morning at the 3rd Annual Samuel Dash Conference on Human Rights, which this year is a joint project of Georgetown's Human Rights Institute and the Center for American Progress. As many of you know, the annual Sam Dash Conference was established in honor of Professor Sam Dash, who served on the faculty here at Georgetown from 1965 until his death in 2004. The Human Rights Institute is delighted to be able to honor Sam Dash's memory through these annual gatherings at which we bring together prominent human rights advocates, scholars, and decision makers to debate pressing human rights issues. We're especially pleased this year to be partnering with the Center for American Progress. Sam Dash was an extraordinary man with an exceptional commitment to his work, to his students, and to the cause of human rights. He also was extraordinarily devoted to his family and his friends, and I want to thank them for making this annual event possible. Thank you especially Sarah, Judy, and Rachel for being here today. Sam Dash was perhaps best known as chief counsel of the historic Senate Watergate Committee, which investigated the Nixon administration's involvement in the now famous break-in at the Democratic National Committee. As we all know, the Senate Watergate Committee's investigation riveted the nation, uncovered the existence of the Oval Office tapes, and ultimately led to President Nixon's resignation. Here at Georgetown, Sam Dash served as the director of the Institute of Criminal Law and Procedure. As a professor of criminal law and professional responsibility, he drew upon his experience as a trial attorney with the Justice Department, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and several Philadelphia law firms to make the law come alive for his students. Sam Dash was also an extraordinary leader in the field of human rights. He sat on the board of directors of the International League of Human Rights and traveled the world on human rights missions. He went to Northern Ireland to investigate the 1972 Bloody Sunday incident and to the Soviet Union and Chile to uncover human rights abuses in those countries. Most famously, in 1985, he was the first American permitted by the government of South Africa to visit Nelson Mandela in prison. And Sam was deeply involved in the mediation efforts that ultimately led to Mandela's release. The Sam Dash Conference on Human Rights is a keystone project of Georgetown Law's Human Rights Institute. Through undertakings such as this conference, our institute aims to bring together decision makers, scholars, human rights advocates to discuss pressing and urgent human rights issues. We also aim to serve as a reference to the larger human rights community. Our topic for today, the future of human rights, is a critical and timely issue. In just 9 months, our country will inaugurate a new president, and with this change in leadership, we are likely to see some important changes in policies concerning human rights. Today's conference, therefore, seeks to seize the opportunity inherent in this period of transition to shape debate about America's stance on human rights and to stress the importance of reviving U.S. leadership and U.S. credibility in protecting human rights and abiding by the rule of law. With these goals in mind, we've brought together an outstanding group of experts to help us think through a way forward, a potential path for any new presidential administration. We are deeply honored that so many distinguished guests have agreed to join us today to share their views on this important subject. You can read in your program about the multitude of experiences that they bring to today's conference. Let me just note that our speakers include several leaders of human rights organizations, former U.S. ambassadors, and leading officials in the executive and legislative branch, an award-winning journalist, and of course our former Secretary of State, whom we will warmly welcome this morning, and the current prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who will be introduced by the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The insights of all these speakers and the conversations we hope to have with all of you we hope will help map out a way forward. Let me emphasize again on behalf of Georgetown Law's Human Rights Institute how pleased I am to see you all here today at this conference to honor Sam Dash's memory, and to add how much I have enjoyed and appreciated working together with the Center for American Progress in making this gathering possible. And with this, I'd like to turn the podium over to John Podesta, who is President and CEO of the Center for American Progress and a wonderful visiting professor here at Georgetown. I'm delighted to be able to work with John both as a colleague and as a co-sponsor of this conference. John Podesta.
Thank you, Jane. It's really quite an honor to be here. As Jane noted, I'm kind of dual-hatted here this morning. I have been and remain a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, but of course I'm also the president of the Center for American Progress, and on the Center's behalf, I want to welcome you all and thank you for participating in today's conference. I also want to take a moment and thank Dina Lenikoff and Jane and Bill and all the organizers of this conference for pulling together such a wonderful event, and for this book, which Bill edited and pulled together. It's really, I think, going to add an enormous amount to our understanding of the cause of human rights. I'm quite proud that the Center was able to co-sponsor this event. Since its founding, the Center has been committed to promoting the common good both at home and abroad, and that concept has really been the driver of much of the work we do. On the national security front, we've worked to revitalize America's global leadership so that our foreign policy is once again grounded in a respect for human rights, in the just use of force, international engagement, and global equity. And that's why I think it's so fitting that we're here today at the Sam Dash Conference, because I think we honor his work and we honor his memory. He was a great friend and mentor of mine, and I think that people know about his involvement in the cause of justice in the United States, but I think millions of people really around the world know him as a champion of human rights, and so I hope that we can be half as good as he was this morning and half as graceful. I think it's also fitting that later this afternoon we'll be honoring Congressman Tom Lantos, who we lost in February, but who's spent a lifelong commitment to the cause of human rights and was the leading champion of human rights in the United States Congress. I think that all of us here who have joined in this room believe that when human rights don't play a major role in American foreign policy, our security and our international credibility suffer. To that end, we believe that it's our duty to restore America's commitment to the international rule of law. In recent years, there were some, including, and I say this with great sadness, some senior lawyers in the Department of Justice who believe that America could toss aside the mantle of the leadership on human rights and more than a century of American policy on military justice in favor of a perceived expediency. I take with great honor the fact that I was able to serve in the Department of Justice, and I recognize that the thousands of distinguished attorneys that served there. But there were some who I think thought that it was possible to reject the Geneva Conventions as quaint and obsolete, and then tried to clear their conscience by convoluted legal reasoning to justify ignoring conventions on torture and abuse of prisoners. I think this has done incalculable damage to the image of America with friends and foes alike. We saw some of the numbers displayed in the video earlier. Now, for an entire new generation of young people across the globe, the symbols and images attached to the United States, at least at the moment, are not the Statue of Liberty, the breaking down of the Berlin Wall. They're the black hole of Guantanamo and the image of a hooded Iraqi standing on a box with electrodes attached to his body at Abu Ghraib. The challenge we have before us now is to undo those policies and to restore America's place in the global world order. The U.S., I think, has an important duty to reclaim its role as a leader in the global community and act on its responsibility to protect the vulnerable. I think that, again, at the center, we try to do that in our daily work, particularly through the Enough Project, which is led by Gail Smith and John Pendergrast, who work on conflict resolution, and through the work that Bill does at the center. But I think that this conference is another indication that of the direction that we can go and the role that we can help play in doing that. I think of no better person to jumpstart the conference than our first speaker, who has a long history helping to strengthen America's diplomatic ties, advocating for democracy and the protection of human rights. Madeleine Albright was the country's 64th Secretary of State. She was confirmed 99-0 in her vote in the Senate. She was, of course, the first woman Secretary of State, and in that capacity was the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government. And I think that the fact that she carried on the cause of women across the globe is an indication of the importance of that position. She's the founder of and the principal of the Albright Group, a global strategy firm which many of us in this room have the pleasure of working with on a regular basis. I'm not going to recite her legions of accomplishments and honors. Suffice it to say that Madeleine is the rarest of combinations, a consummate diplomat and an unwavering progressive champion. Since leaving office, she continues to lead and present the progressive face of American foreign policy and America's best values to the rest of the world. Madeleine's been an outspoken critic of some of the approaches that this administration has taken to foreign policy, particularly on this question of human rights. But her criticism is always followed by expert analysis and an offering of viable alternatives. She challenges us to think bigger and bolder, to look at the evolving world in new ways, and to come up with creative solutions to ward off future problems. She's a best-selling author with a wonderful biography, a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, about the role of religion in national policy and foreign policy. I guess it's no surprise that Madeleine just published her latest book, which is titled Memo to the President-elect: How We Can Restore America's Reputation and Leadership. I think we can all agree that her reflections are invaluable today. Whoever's elected in November, one thing is certain: he or she should have Madeleine's book ready at hand in the Oval Office. With the expertise and candor that we've come to know from her, Madeleine's latest work is exactly, I think, what the next president will need: the perfect blend of past lessons learned applied to the challenges and obstacles of American foreign policy confronts today and will confront in the future. From the days that the Center for American Progress first opens its doors, Madeleine has brought that uncanny spirit of optimism and sharp intellect to our work. She serves as a member of our board of trustees. We're so glad that she could join us today. She's offered her time and her energy. She's been a tremendous leader and partner in many of our programs and so much work around the world. We're truly grateful for her constant counsel and guidance. I think progressives around the world, she had me over meeting with some of her colleagues in Denmark just a few weeks ago, would be hard-pressed to find a better ally than Madeleine Albright and a better voice for a progressive foreign policy than the one we will hear from this morning. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming an inspiration to progressives around the world, Secretary Madeleine Albright.
Thank you very much. John, thank you. I think I'm fine, thanks. Thank you very much, John. Thanks for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. I just actually came back from China, and I was going through Chicago as the first port of entry, and there I was getting undressed for the security people, and I put my stuff down on the conveyor belt, and the lady ahead of me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles? Mine all leak." And I said, "Well, you know, I got them at the Container Store." And then I was going through the magnetometer, and the guard said, "Oh my God, it's you." And so he said, "Well, I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you?" So we stopped, and he held up the whole line while I had my picture taken with him. And then I get back to my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, "So what exactly happened here?" I said, "Well, I used to be Secretary of State." And she said, "Of Bosnia?" So thank you, John. So I'm very happy to be with all of you this morning. And this morning we assemble with one purpose in mind, and that is to prove that a day-long conference devoted to foreign policy need not in itself be a violation of human rights. It helps that the topics we will address are timely, our panelists charismatic, our purpose just, and that a delicious lunch will be served. And for this bounty, we really have to thank our sponsors. The Samuel Dash Center, as John said, pays tribute to a true champion of law, and no young attorney could ask for a better career model than Sam Dash. I, in my house, am kind of known as the mother of all attorneys. 3 out of 4 of them graduated from here, so I feel very much at home. As for the Center for American Progress, before this century began, CAP did not even exist. Before the decade is out, it will have made a positive impact in virtually every arena of domestic and world affairs. CAP is where great ideas come to be nurtured, and where American patriots draw up plans for bringing out the best in our country. And so I commend John Podesta and every foot soldier in his growing empire. I also want to congratulate Bill Schulz and the contributors to the most thoughtful new book, The Future of Human Rights. And as that volume reflects, we can expect the future of human rights to be both controversial and complex, a reality that provides a useful starting point for my own remarks this morning. Perhaps we should begin with the question of what a human rights policy actually is. In one conception, such a policy consists of measuring the actions of each country against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, identifying bad actors, and adopting resolutions aimed at shaming them into doing better. In another conception, human rights are thought of more broadly, taking into account issues of war, peace, terrorism, development, disease, and the environment. There are variations, too, in thinking about the basis for human rights. For some, rights are derived primarily from law. For others, ideology. To still others, they stem from beliefs about religion or ethics. There are also people with a more suspicious view, who see human rights as propaganda designed to help one group of countries undermine the sovereignty of others. Adding to the complexity is the long-standing debate about the relative legitimacy of economic and social rights compared to civil and political. In earlier times, this debate raged against the backdrop of the rivalry between communism and capitalism. It persists now in the context of globalization and the emergence of a governmental model that combines economic reform with political repression. This model appeals to leaders who would like to benefit from the global economy without putting at risk their own positions of power. In China's case, the model has been called market Leninism, and it creates a stiff political challenge to the West. To compete, we must prove that freedom leads not only to the voting booth, but also to food on the table and a better life. And this requires a balance. The power of the market must be connected to social justice, but the promise of economic security can't be used to deny individual freedom. We can't allow voting and eating to be viewed as opposing concepts. In any successful system, they must reinforce each other. Another complicating factor in our discussion is that, as important as human rights are, they are far from the only issue a president must take into account when managing world affairs. Consider, for example, North Korea. It's no secret that the government in Pyongyang is wretched, repressive, and cruel. And so the argument's made that we should not deal with them until it reforms. But engagement and appeasement are not the same. Support for human rights should be a central part of our policy, but food aid may be essential to keep innocent people from dying, and protection from nuclear war is as basic a human right as I can imagine. If we have the opportunity to create a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, we should seize it. A refusal to negotiate might leave us with no chance for a nuclear agreement and still no improvements in the way that North Korea treats its people, and what would be the benefit of that? We must remember that foreign policy cannot be managed with a cookie cutter. In a diverse world, flexibility will sometimes be more important than consistency. And in an imperfect world, perfect solutions are often not possible, while imperfect means are all that exist. Human rights, then, are indeed complicated. So is morality. We would be well advised to approach these issues with humility. We cannot pretend to know all the answers, but neither can we be so conscious of what is complex that we lose sight of what is clear. Humility is no excuse for silence. For although we may not know all the truth about anything, we do know something about truth. For example, we know that torture is both a strategic blunder and a moral abomination. It is not a weapon in the fight against terror. Torture is a gift to Al-Qaeda. In this case, our interests and ideals are identical. Torture should never again be practiced by the United States or excused by our president, or for that matter, by the vice president. Due process of law was developed for a reason, to protect the rights of the innocent, and more specifically to provide a fair means by which the innocent may be separated from the guilty. Emergency situations do arise, but 6.5 years have passed since 9/11. In the time since, the spectacle of Guantanamo has not prevented terror. It has served as a powerful recruiting tool. The time has long since passed to close that prison and throw away the key. It was also a mistake for the United States under this administration to withdraw its signature from the International Criminal Court. No country has a greater stake than America in a global system that protects rights and enforces responsibilities. After all, we created the Nuremberg trials. We were the driving force behind the International Court of Justice, and during Vietnam, we repeatedly invoked the Geneva Conventions on behalf of our prisoners of war. In the 1990s, we led the fight to create a war crimes tribunal for Rwanda and the Balkans, and even today, we rely on treaty commitments and the UN Security Council to help block Iran's quest for nuclear arms. The America I love is not a child that pouts when rules good enough for others are suddenly applied to us. The America I love is the world's leading defender and exemplar of international law. Correcting the Bush administration's more obvious errors is the beginning of what the next president must do, but only the beginning. Perceptions of America will not change without a persistent and determined effort. The average age of people in many countries in South Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East is only about 17. For those so young, the scope of memory is short. For many, America's role in the world prior to this century has no meaning. To some, America is symbolized not by the Statue of Liberty or the defeat of Hitler, but by the images of Abu Ghraib. These unfair impressions have been made worse by agents of hate, for although the mistakes our nation has made in recent years have hurt us, not all our wounds are self-inflicted. We have enemies who long preceded the Bush administration and will surely persist after it is gone. The world is not, as some suggest, headed towards a clash of civilizations, but we are engaged in a battle of ideas, a test as to whether people should be governed by laws or by passion, by agreed principles or by fear. It is essential that in the years ahead, the United States reoccupy the high ground in this battle. And that won't happen overnight, but it will happen if we adopt a broad approach to protecting human rights, acknowledge our own shortcomings, and strive to strengthen global norms. It will happen if we employ our nation's ingenuity and wealth to defeat the axis of evil, poverty, ignorance, and disease. It will happen if we show that America is exceptional because of our powerful commitment to justice, not by using our power to carve out exceptions for ourselves. And it will happen if we engage patiently in the competition of ideas, demonstrating daily the benefits of free institutions, open minds, unfettered debate, and concern for our collective future. It follows that the foundation for any human rights policy should be the promotion of democracy. Human rights depend on the proper relationship between governments and the people. In a democracy, power itself comes from the people. Now, I've been around a long time, and there are no stars in my eyes. I understand well that democracy is only a form of government, not a pathway to paradise, where bad ideas are vanquished and everyone agrees with us. Democracy doesn't guarantee anything, but it does provide the best chance that leaders will be held accountable, minority rights respected, and abuses corrected over time. I know there are some who believe that electoral gains made by Islamist candidates in such places as Iraq, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority should cause us to refrain from encouraging elections in certain parts of the world. I don't share that conclusion. Every candidate and every party who runs in a free election has an obligation to renounce violence and observe constitutional procedures. But every government has an obligation to establish means that allow for the peaceful expression of dissent and the popular election of candidates. Failure to do so leads not to stability, but to its counterfeit, causing pressure for change to build until it is released explosively instead of gradually, often replacing one form of despotism with another. At the same time, we must understand that democracy is not instant coffee, but rather a slow brewing process in which fair elections are merely one stage. True democracy requires an independent judiciary, a free press, political parties, and the right of civil society to organize. There's also more basic reason for promoting democracy. If the United States loses its passion for liberty, we will no longer be America. In 1861, speaking on the occasion of George Washington's birthday, Abraham Lincoln said that the Declaration of Independence did more than bestow liberty on America. It gave hope to the world that in due time the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men and women, and that all should have an equal chance. Rather than surrender that principle, said Lincoln, he would choose to be assassinated on the spot. We know that the list of human rights challenges is long, from the brutal repression in Rangoon to the rolling genocide in Darfur, from the prisons of Havana to the streets of Zimbabwe, from the future health of our planet to the use of religion as a club. We have learned too much of life to expect perfection, but we care too much to settle for the world as it is. Ultimately, we understand that the issue of human rights is about more than law or the specific interests of any nation. It is about the attitude we have towards one another and towards life. To me, It boils down to a simple but profound principle. Every individual counts. This is the principle that is at the heart of every democracy. It provides the basis for the kind of leadership that could restore respect for America around the world. It creates the foundation for unity across every barrier of geography, race, gender, and creed. It will enable us, if acted upon, to benefit from the contributions of all people, and it can serve as the starting point for a serious discussion about the future of human rights. Thank you all very, very much.
I am going to come over here to this mic, and we're going to have a period for questions and answers. And I'm going to call on my colleague, Rosa Brooks, in 1 second. But I'm going to take the prerogative, who's first to the mic. I would ask you to identify yourself when you come to the mic and state your question. I'll just take the prerogative of holding this mic and ask you one question. You went through a long list, Madeleine, at the end, which was very, I think, incisive. But you've been traveling around the country now over these past many months, and I wonder what your perspective is on whether the United States itself has intervention fatigue, and whether a new president can rally the American public to the causes that need attention in places like Darfur and Zimbabwe and Cuba and the list that you mentioned. And then I'm going to call on Rosa.
I think that the American public is tired of the war in Iraq. And not necessarily tired of responsibilities throughout the world. There's no question in my mind that the American people are through with the war in Iraq. There are clearly people who are very concerned about the military. What is so interesting, I think, to many of us is that there's such a different feeling about the military and this war and the military in Vietnam. That people are admiring of the military, and that they're not out in the streets in any way that would show disrespect for the military or a desire that the military be treated well upon their return. I do think, however, that there is a different feeling about the fact that the U.S. And that all of us are involved in some kind of a sense of responsibility for what goes on in other countries. That doesn't mean that it necessarily is a matter of making sure that our troops go there, because I think people understand that our troops are spread very thin. But I think there is a new understanding of the fact that we are involved internationally, that we're dependent on each other. I found very interesting, I actually teach at Georgetown up on the Hill, and the students there are the ones who began the organization on Darfur. The issue of Darfur does not go away. I think we are seeing a sense of horror about what is happening in Zimbabwe, and a sense that the U.S. should be there to help, but not necessarily with troops, but in terms of assistance generally. And I think there's more of an international sense than I would have thought as a result of fatigue with the war.
Rosa Brooks, who's a professor here at Georgetown and served with us in administration. She was the senior advisor to Harold Koh during the tail end of your period in the State Department. And then I just invite people to come to the mics, and we'll go back and forth.
Great. Thanks very much, John. Secretary Albright, it's an honor to have you with us. We don't always get the Secretary of State of Bosnia here at Georgetown Law Center. And I actually wanted to ask you something about that first. I have two questions. One is very general. It's a follow-up to the question John asked, and the other is a little bit more specific. The general question, which is in many ways a follow-up to John's question, not only do people around the world have very short memories about American foreign policy and America's role in the world, but as your anecdote that you began with about the airport security process indicates, a lot of Americans have pretty short memories too. It's in many ways rather shocking but not surprising that an average American wouldn't recognize the former Secretary of State. It wasn't that long ago. And I wonder, first, if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of changing American hearts and minds. What do we need to do to convince ordinary Americans, not students at Georgetown Law Center, not students at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, who presumably are sort of pre-selected to care about these issues, but the average American going through the security at O'Hare, that foreign policy matters, that it should be an issue that they should care about in the presidential elections that are coming up, in congressional elections, that they should dedicate their hearts, their minds, their tax dollars to caring about what happens in the rest of the world and America's role in the world. Then the second question is somewhat more specific. You're talking, of course, to an audience that has many law students in it. And as we all know, to our great sadness, a lot of the terrible abuses of the last 7 years have been have involved lawyers and have involved legal maneuverings to argue that interrogation techniques that amount to torture are in fact perfectly legal, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you have specific thoughts on a legal agenda for a new administration to try to begin to undo some of the damage that's been done.
I didn't think that on the second question we'd immediately get to me blaming the media for everything. But I do think that one of the real problems that we have is that there is very little real information out there for the public to understand what the issues are all about. And I think the American public, I say this, I think we're the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And part of what happens is that there might be something horrible that happens somewhere. We are very generous in terms of the tsunami relief, or when there is an earthquake, or even on Darfur initially. But I think that because there is not enough information in terms of the background of a particular issue, or it has a lot of unpronounceable names, that in fact we kind of don't have all the information on it. I also think that there has to be a different way in our educational system of having people understand what geography is about. For instance, if you go into an average American classroom, there's a flat map out there with the Western Hemisphere in the middle and these two little things on the side. And whenever I've gone into a classroom in an elementary or secondary school, I ask for a globe. And I say most of the people in the world live on the other side of this globe. It has led some children to ask me if the Australians walk upside down, but I think that there really is not enough information out there. What I find interesting, though, as I've traveled around, and it goes a little bit to John's question, is that as a result, I think, of economic issues, in many ways people are more involved in understanding foreign policy than they think. I mean, you kind of have to tell them they're talking about foreign policy. It's like telling people they speak prose. And I think the immigration issue has made people either understand it negatively or positively. So I think the more education and the integration of our lives with foreign policy I think is one of the major issues that is really out there. On the legal question, I think, first of all, back to the media again, Jack Bauer, it has glorified many ways the idea that you extract information from people or that you beat them up. I do think that, I said as the mother of 4 lawyers, I really do feel that the legal profession itself has to re-seize and acquaint themselves with various aspects of the Constitution and issues of habeas corpus, and a sense that it is not unpatriotic to talk about due process, and that it is possible, in fact, to put yourself into that guise. And the law schools, I think, obviously this one does a great job, but I do think that there can't be this sense that we're afraid of due process. And it's been, you're called unpatriotic. We all are if we ask questions or raise such an issue, and I think we just have to push back on it. Yeah.
Could you please identify yourself and then ask?
My name is Charlie Clements. I'm the President and CEO of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. And Secretary Albright, my question really involves Darfur again. And why have so few international leaders, so few heads of state been willing to speak out at all to say anything about Darfur? I think until Sarkozy was elected, almost no one in Europe has taken a stand at all. Their memory of genocide should be a lot more recent than ours. We know that perhaps Bush has been more interested in the ties with the Sudanese government. We know their head of intelligence has traveled here a number of times, but why have so few other leaders felt the obligations of the Convention on Genocide are spoken out?
Well, I think, you know, it's so ironic that this actually has happened, because so many people have rightfully been critical of what the Clinton administration didn't do about Rwanda, which I always called volcanic genocide, that happened after the plane of the Rwandan president was shot down. And while I certainly wish we had done more, I didn't think that even if we had, we couldn't have gotten there on time to stop it, whereas what we're doing is watching rolling genocide. I'm not sure I would give that strong an indictment against some of the Europeans, because I think that some Scandinavians and various have been helpful and have looked at it. I think the problem is that, I know this is not a good answer, it's so complicated. I met recently with Jan Eliasson, who was the former Swedish ambassador here and then foreign minister, and now the Secretary General's envoy. And I'm a groupie. I created a group of former foreign ministers, which is now called Madeleine and her exes. We had Jan Eliasson as one of them, and he came to meet with us about 3 weeks ago in Copenhagen, and he described the problem in terms of, first of all, that the rebel groups keep dividing and very hard to get them together in any shape or form to talk. The Sudanese government feels very much bolstered by outside forces, even though the Chinese say that they're putting some pressure on them. The Russians haven't put much pressure on them either. That in fact, there are also problems that Bashir has said that he would not allow anything but African troops to go in, and part of the problem here is that some of the other troops from countries are former colonial powers, so they don't want them in. And so he has that excuse of the fact that the AU forces can't seem to pull themselves together. And then finally, what has happened also is that there have been a whole new group of people coming into the villages that where the refugees who are now partially in Chad are. So it is, you know, the international community has a very hard time dealing with a problem that is that complex. And also, in a strange way, so of such long duration. It's outrageous, frankly. I do think that the U.S., that took the right step in terms of declaring it a genocide, Secretary Powell did that, and I think we should do more in terms of lift and providing humanitarian assistance. But one of the issues that's always out there is, if we do a no-fly zone, for instance, that in fact it stops food coming in there. There are arguments among various elements of the humanitarian community that make it a very complex and difficult issue. I can explain it. I can't tell you it's the right policy. Yeah.
Come to the side.
Felice Gare, the Jacob Laston Institute. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I wanted to ask you about the situation in China right now. And specifically, I remember very clearly that you went to China for the Beijing World Conference, and so did the First Lady, despite criticisms. The President has said he is going to go to the Olympics. Do you think that he should boycott the opening ceremonies? Do you think he should ask to travel to Lhasa first? Do you think there should be some other elements in this equation that would actually help people in Tibet?
Well, first of all, let me say that I've been through two versions of this in some way. I was in the White House when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And the experience there led me actually to create the course that I now teach, which is called the National Security Toolbox. I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. And so what is in the toolbox? And the reason that I came up with that course was because of an interagency meeting we had after the Soviets invaded to try to figure out how to punish them. We knew that we couldn't get them out of Afghanistan right away. And one of the things that was brought up was to boycott the Olympics when they were in Moscow. I think it turned out that that was not particularly useful. It punished our athletes, and it didn't really, the Russians didn't care. Other people came, and then they boycotted when we were in Los Angeles. So I am not for a total boycott of these Olympics. I do think that the president should, for now, say that he's not going to the opening ceremonies. I think that couched in a way that would allow for some, if there's a change in the situation, or if the Chinese do what I think they should do, which is talk to the Dalai Lama and have transparency over what is going on in Tibet, that there's a lever that's created if the president says, I'm not going to the opening ceremonies. I think it would, what is interesting was when President Clinton went to China, we talked about Tibet openly in an open press conference, and made very clear that that situation was unacceptable. I, along with lots of people, have met with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has said that he's not for independence. He's for autonomy for the Tibetan people. I think they make a mistake in making him into some kind of a manipulator and an organizer of everything and an evil person. I don't think I've ever met anybody, ever, in my life, met anybody who is as warm and lovely and gentle and holy as the Dalai Lama. So, so I think that they're unhappy, frankly, amazing human being. So I think we need to keep pushing the Chinese on this. And now the other thing, I did go to the Beijing conference, and there were questions about us going. I happen to have, because of my background, very strong anti-communist credentials. And I feel very strongly that we made a big difference by going to Beijing. That many thousands of women making trouble in China, they didn't know what to do with us. It was very funny because they had issued white sheets to the cab drivers to throw over the lesbians, and then people came up to me and say, so where is this country of lesbia? So, but the bottom line is they moved the non-governmental organizations out of the city. It didn't stop us from going to visit them. So I think having a lot of people in Beijing is not a bad idea. I do have only one prediction to make about the Olympics, and that is that the Chinese will win all the medals because nobody else will be able to breathe.
Sir. Madam Secretary, my name is Bruce Knotts. I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I retired last year after 25 years of service, so I had the honor of serving under your leadership. My question, speaking of lesbians, is about gay and lesbian rights. I had a conversation in 2006 with Assistant Secretary of State Kristen Silverberg about the U.S. vote in the United Nations, which at that time supported initiatives by the Islamic government of Iran to bar gay and lesbian organizations from having consultative status at the United Nations. And I talked to her about how Iran practices what they call curative rape, where they rape lesbians to cure them of their lesbianism. And I talked about the gross human rights violations perpetrated on gays and lesbians around the world. Fortunately, the U.S. did change its vote in 2006 and now votes for inclusion rather than exclusion of gay and lesbian groups. But I'd like to hear your advice to a new American administration on taking a leadership role on gay and lesbian rights around the world.
Well, I think the United States, well, first of all, we have to elect the right people, but I think that the question here is how the U.S. can, in fact, make clear what we believe in, which is choice, and that we should, in fact, be clear that people need to have their human rights respected. I have to tell you, frankly, there was a problem when I was at the UN because there was this organization called NAMBLA that went kind of undermined the whole concept in many ways of gay and lesbian rights by advocating a lot of things that other people did not believe in. So I think it's a matter of the gay and lesbian community also understanding how it wants to present itself, and the U.S. should be supportive of that.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Leo Kramer. I cannot be here without first remembering the inspiration of Sam Dash, just in passing. He was an inspiration to me. And your talk was very inspiring, and it reminded me of matters about which I care about my country. I think you said at one point the importance of food on the table and a better life. I just returned from Israel and Palestine, to which I've devoted a great deal of my life in that most difficult matter. My country has cut off the food of the people in Gaza. My country has cut off the power in the kitchens of the people in Gaza. And we can go down the list of what my country has done. And we've had many years of failure in that situation. I would very much appreciate your advice as to what we should not repeat in the future that failed, and what we can do to help both of these people live a life of peace and justice. Thank you.
Well, I think that the issue of Israeli-Palestinian issue is one that we clearly lived with for a long time. John and I spent a lot of time on this issue, and I believe came pretty close to having some kind of a solution. And my own sense is that, with some pride, that ultimately the parameters that President Clinton put down will be the solution in terms of a just way of dealing with how the Palestinians and Israelis can live together. But on the more specific aspect now, I think that, and this is what I was alluding to in my remarks, the United States pushed for the elections among the Palestinians without, in fact, having an entry fee, which is that Hamas should give up violence as a mode of operating in order to be part of the elections. They won the election by small margins in various districts, but there should not have, my own view, should not have been a push for those elections at the time without this entry fee, because if you look at Northern Ireland, one of the issues was that we got the IRA and Sinn Féin split so that there was a peaceful arm that we could deal with. Hamas is on the terrorist list. I actually put it there because we were looking at organizations that were sponsoring violence. And so the hope had been is that maybe Hamas would split in some way so that we could deal with it. I think that it's a tragedy in terms of the way the Palestinians have lived and are living. I was in Israel in December and went to Ramallah and went up in various parts of the West Bank. The contrast between life in Tel Aviv and life in Ramallah is something that I wouldn't be comfortable with if I were an Israeli, because, but the question is how to make this change. The famous roadmap wasn't taken out of the glove compartment until a little while ago. And I think that basically this administration has not paid enough attention. So I hope that the next administration will, in fact, sit down again, be the country that brings the parties together, puts some new ideas back on the table, serves in that particular way, that various countries, I've spent a lot of time now with the Norwegians, who are not members of the European Union and have been dealing a lot. They are providing humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and that other countries and that humanitarian assistance should not be cut off. It's my understanding that the U.S. actually is providing some humanitarian assistance.
I should say, I'm tempted to add, but I should not. I hope I'll have a chance to talk to you sometime.
Okay, yeah.
Let's go this way.
Good morning, Madam Secretary. Nora Bustani with the Washington Post. It's good to see you. I have two questions, totally unrelated. The first one is, everybody knows that the holdup for the deployment of the hybrid UN African force in Darfur, or one of the holdups, is that they are lacking a dozen plus helicopters. Had you been Secretary of State now, or UN Ambassador, how could you have made the administration help? I mean, we are spending trillions of dollars in Iraq, yet a dozen helicopters seem to be lacking in a very important humanitarian mission. What would you have done?
I would have gone to John Podesta. No, I don't understand it, because I think that part of what has happened is that there doesn't seem to be enough coordination among the various departments in the government at this stage. I don't know, frankly, whether they feel that they need all the helicopters in Iraq. I don't know the answer to this. I do think, to me, it has also been a bit of a mystery as to why this is so difficult. But I think that they should have a principals meeting on this particular subject and try to sort out what the problem is. It is a question, I must agree. Yeah.
My other question is, in retrospect, do you believe that imposing sanctions in any way helps advance human rights in oppressive countries?
Well, I have to go back to my toolbox.
Okay.
You'll be so sorry you asked this, but I will try not to do 50 minutes. First of all, I think that the real question, when you open up that toolbox, there actually are not a lot of tools in it. You have diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. You have the economic tools, which are either incentives or disincentives. You have the threat of the use of force, intelligence, law enforcement. That's it. And sometimes people feel that diplomacy is too slow and that force is too harsh. And so you somehow automatically pick up the sanctions tool. I think we have learned a lot about sanctions, and that is that full sanctions are very difficult to keep on and also do some harm. But I do think that something that has to be understood and is always forgotten, that full sanctions, no matter where, always exclude food and medicine. It's a matter of how it's brought in, whether the dictator, this was the case in Iraq, whether the dictator allows the distribution of food and medicine to anything but his cronies. But full sanctions are hard to maintain. So I think what we have learned, and we learned this with the former Yugoslavia, is what we call smart sanctions, which are sanctions that are more specifically applied to the leadership, to the cronies, to their banking accounts, to their travel. But again, it's the lack of tools. This weekend, my class at Georgetown, we are going to do a game simulation on Iran. We did North Korea, but I got tired of that. So we'll see. And they are working exactly with this question of what to do, what are the tools that are available. And keep in mind that that toolbox does not have a lot in it, and some combination of those tools is all that we have. But the smart sanctions, I think, are an interesting way to go now.
Thank you.
We're nearly out of time, but people have been waiting, so I'm going to do something a little bit differently, which is I'm going to let the four people who have been waiting ask their questions, and then Madeleine can answer any of the questions that she wants to.
Thank you. It's an honor to have you here, Madam Secretary. My name is Anaita Arya. I'm from the Netherlands Embassy. And you talked about the restoration of U.S. reputation, their allies and their strategic allies, and of course their traditional allies in Europe. My question is, do you think that the next president, if he signs the international, or she, also a possibility, signs the treaty of the International Criminal Court, will that restore, or will that be a step in the phase of restoring U.S. reputation? And if so, how should the next president convince Congress and the American public about what the mere value is of signing and ratifying the Treaty of International Criminal Court? Thank you.
Go back and forth and then we'll...
Okay. Good morning, Madam Secretary. My name is Arsalan Iftikhar. I am contributing editor for Islamica magazine and an international human rights lawyer. I think for any human rights advocates out there, they will remember your 60 Minutes interview where you were asked whether the sanctions against Iraq, which cost the lives of 5,000 children a month, in excess of 1 million innocent lives while Saddam Hussein continued to build his palaces, was worth the price the sanctions, and I don't honestly believe that we can have any discussion of human rights without giving you the opportunity to answer as to, with the luxury of hindsight at your disposal, do you still stand by those statements that the sanctions in Iraq were worth it? Thank you.
And
thank you, Madam Albright. Thanks for being here. Just to follow up to Leo Kramer's question.
Could you please identify
I'm sorry. My name's Karen Ryan. I'm from the Carter Center in Atlanta. In terms of how the toolbox, I think you've laid out a very interesting set of tools. And in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, Secretary Baker did bring some pressure to bear on Israel to stop the settlement expansion. And I think the Carter Center works a lot in the West Bank and Gaza. And I think probably one of the biggest problems in terms of our reputation, who we are there, and how we're all going to get out of the quagmire there, is the rapid 5.5% per year, the settlement expansion in the West Bank, the real dissolution of any potential Palestinian state. A road was just authorized by the Supreme Court of Israel just last week that was previously disallowed by the Supreme Court of Israel if it were to be used only for settlers. And now the Supreme Court is saying, even though Palestinians are being barred from this road in the West Bank, it will be allowed. So there's this kind of rolling, you said rolling genocide, there's a rolling occupation with permanent checkpoints, 75 of them in the West Bank that are partly paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars, permanent checkpoints. These are like airport terminals. So I think, the question is, how could we, from our toolbox, really lean on Israel to do something? It's great that Secretary Rice is saying, is being vocal, but shouldn't we be doing something more than having Secretary Rice call for the stop of settlement expansion? Thanks.
And last.
Ann Heel. Madam Secretary, your comments and your remarks, I think, that hit everyone in the room when you identified the three axes of evil as ignorance, disease, and poverty. I'd like you to, that's a big sweep. That's not technical. I think one of the core things facing our generation going forward. And related to that, recently I was looking at the data on refugees. And numbers of refugees in the world were going down until 2002. At the height of the boat people, there were 14 million. There are now 30 million refugees and displaced people. It's increased 6 million since 2002. That doesn't improve our chances of addressing poverty, disease, or ignorance.
Thank you. Well, I'll begin by answering the question about the Iraqi children. I've answered this question many times, and it's always interesting that what I say doesn't seem to penetrate on this. I was interviewed, and I said something genuinely stupid. I have said it was stupid, and I have said if there's ever anybody in whatever audience I'm asked that has never said anything they regret, I wish they'd stand up. But I have to explain what this is about, and it has to do with the question that I answered previously about sanctions. When I arrived at the United Nations, the ceasefire of the Iraq War was in fact translated into resolutions of the Security Council, and we were dealing with them practically every day. And there were sanctions, the toughest sanctions regime that's ever been imposed, with an exception for food and medicine. And Saddam Hussein would not allow the food and medicine to go in, nor would he pay for it, even though he was building huge palaces all over the place. So the question was how to get him to allow the food and medicine to go in, to be distributed to the variety of people. And we kept arguing about that until finally in 1996 we had the Oil for Food program, which ended up not being so satisfactory. But that was an attempt to try to get food and medicine in. I find also interesting the numbers always keep changing in terms of the number of people who died. Obviously, I regret any loss of life by children for sanctions. I have said this so many times. I know if you Google me, which is what you must have done, that I'm there as a war criminal. I can explain all. It was a stupid statement. So I regret having made it, and I've said it so many times. I would appreciate if you would actually put that in somewhere. On the issue of the International Criminal Court, I do think that it would be very useful if the United States re-signed. But also, we had a very hard time with this. It's not a simple issue for the United States. I think that the reason we should not have left is because I thought that we could, in fact, be a part of being a friend of the court and try to work in terms of looking at what the new laws on terrorism were going to be, definitions of aggression. And we made a mistake by pulling out. Now, the thing that I think most people don't understand, which this audience clearly does, is that you don't have to submit to the International Criminal Court if you have a legitimate legal national system of your own. Now, having just said some of the earlier issues about habeas corpus and what's happening in Guantanamo, there may be some questions about that, frankly, which make it more complicated. But the bottom line is the ICC is beginning to develop a body of law. I think it would be useful, but I think realistically, and I think, John, you'd probably agree to this, it's not going to be simple for the U.S. to given our sense of sovereignty and where our legal system really is. On the Middle East, I do think that the U.S. needs to be much more involved, not just by drop-ins from the Secretary of State, but a special envoy who really pushes. We said that the settlements were a problem in terms of moving forward. I think that there needs to be more active day-to-day American involvement that allows work on the ground to be done. And so I would hope the next president would appoint somebody to do that on a full-time basis with a peace team. And one way to conclude, I think, is really so appropriate for this audience, and it does have to do with that axis of evil. I have been asked to co-chair a international commission with Hernando de Soto, a Peruvian economist who has a very interesting theory about that if the poor are in fact part of their economic and legal system of a country, they can in fact be contributors to that country. And so we have a commission on the legal empowerment of the poor. It's a very interesting commission under the auspices of the UNDP. We are going to issue our report in the next couple of months. It has 4 former presidents on the commission: Mkapa from Tanzania, Cardoso from Brazil, Zedillo from Mexico, Mary Robinson from Ireland, then Mike Moore, who was head of the WTO and Prime Minister of New Zealand, and an assortment of former finance and foreign ministers. And I think that what we are looking at is the fact that 4 billion out of 6+ billion people in the world are outside any legal system. And that if, in fact, they understood the laws of their country or even had an identity as getting a birth certificate or being a part of a system, that they then, we could begin the aspect of dealing with poverty, ignorance, and disease. And I will tell you one story which to me is a perfect incarnation of this. I went to Kenya last year, about this time actually, and I went to the slum at Kibera in Nairobi, Kibera, and a market there called the Toy Market. It's nothing to do with toys, but that's what it was called. There were about over, I don't know, 5,000 stalls of people that were selling each other used spark plugs and flip-flops and T-shirts. And they had organized, they put on a show for me, something about HIV/AIDS, and then there was a very brilliant young political organizer, and I was there with various public officials, and he was really amazing. He said, "I'd like to thank Secretary Albright for bringing our education minister. She is also our member of parliament, and this is the first time we've ever seen her." And so then he explained that they had a credit system that they had established themselves among the people in this market, where each one put $1 Kenyan a night into a pot, which is about somewhere between 10 and 15 cents. And they then developed a way of lending the money to each other as a result of a council, and they provided money for schooling or uniforms or building a house. And they trusted each other, and they had developed this amazing system. That whole market was just destroyed. I had a letter from the young man. The market was destroyed. They are prepared to rebuild it, but it is a sign that if, first of all, the poor aren't stupid. I think that's one theory that people have, is they're stupid. They're actually more entrepreneurial than most. And I think if they do know their legal rights and democracy really works, then that is the way we deal with the axis of evil of poverty, ignorance, and disease. And you all at a law school, and those of you that know the power of the law, I think can play a huge role in these. I would look forward actually to coming back and presenting that report to all of you, because it's going to be a combination of trying to get law schools and business schools to work together on what I think is a really, really interesting theory of legally empowering 4 billion people. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much.